Okay, today we're going to be talking about two new structures, I guess, the do while loop and a switch statement. Then we're going to be putting them together to create a menu option for our bookcase class. So we wrote a book class, then we wrote a bookcase class that kind of lives on top of that. And then finally, we're going to be writing a controller class that uses a do while loop and a switch statement to print a menu where the user can choose different options like add a book to the bookcase, get a random suggestion of a book to read, search the bookcase, print all the books in the bookcase, so on and so forth. Let's start with the do while loop. So here I'm showing you the syntax of a do while loop. And a do while loop is nothing more than a while loop that has been flipped on its head. Okay, so for a do while loop, we have the do keyword and then an opening curly bracket. Here's the code inside of the loop, our closing curly bracket. And then at the bottom, we have while and our Boolean expression. And there is a semicolon that goes here, so don't forget that. So a normal while loop, you first evaluate the Boolean expression. And if that's true, you go inside. If it's false, you skip over it. So for a normal while loop, it does 0 or more iterations. With a do while loop, you always execute the code inside the first time, and then you evaluate the Boolean expression. So a do while loop does 1 or more iterations. Okay, so that's kind of the basic difference between them. A while loop does 0 or more iterations. A do while loop does 1 or more iterations. Now, the practical difference between them you will encounter over time. So over time, you will find situations where the traditional normal while loop just isn't working. In particular, you need to do a few steps before you evaluate the Boolean expression. And when that happens, you should remember, oh, maybe I should use a do while loop. So here's an example of that. So this is a very silly and simple example where I have an integer I called input, and then I say, enter a number. I read the number, and if that number is 0, then I quit. Otherwise, I continue. I ask them to enter another number, read it, and check if it's 0. So basically, this code just loops until someone enters 0. One thing I do want to point out is that any variable or variables that show up in your Boolean expression must be declared outside of the do while loop. Okay, so notice that I declared the integer input outside of the do while loop. If instead I had declared it inside, so if I'd said int input equals scan.nextInt, that means that the scope of the variable input is right between these two curly brackets. So another way of saying that is that the variable input could only be used, referenced, or modified between these two curly brackets. And that does not include your Boolean expression. So any variable that shows up inside your Boolean expression must be declared outside of the loop. Otherwise, you will get a compile time error. Okay, so I coded this up in BlueJ, so let's look at this and make sure it works. So here's my code. I have my scanner. I declare my variable input. Inside, I say enter a number, type 0 to quit. I read the number, and while that is not equal to 0, I keep going back. If it is equal to 0, then the program ends. Okay, so pretty simple and kind of silly program. Okay, so you can just go through, enter a bunch of integers. Okay, and if we hit 0, it's done. Okay, so just a few things. So again, if I had declared input inside of this, inside of these curly brackets, then when I compile, right, it will say cannot find symbol. Okay, so you have to make sure that your variables that show up in the Boolean expression, that their scope is larger than the do while loop itself. The other thing is, let's imagine, though, that we didn't know about the do while loop. And let's say that we did want to do this, but all we knew about was a while loop. Okay, and you can do this with a while loop, but we'll see that it's not quite as natural. Okay, so I'm just going to comment this out. Okay, So with a normal while loop, I would have to say, let's see, first I need to get the number. So system.out.println, enter a number type 0. Okay, and then I'd need to read the number in. And then I would check if input does not equal 0. If input does not equal 0, then we'll keep going. So I have to do it again. System.out.println, enter a number type 0 to quit. And then input equals scan.next. Okay, so let's just compile and make sure that this is the same program. Okay, so we can enter some numbers. Okay, and then when I hit 0, it quits. Okay, so from the user's perspective, it's the same program and there isn't any difference in terms of what the user interacts with. However, looking at this code, using a normal while loop, I actually had to copy and paste or replicate the code inside my while loop, and I had to do it outside of the while loop. Another way of saying that is I had to do the first iteration. I had to do the first iteration first outside the while loop, and then I could check my Boolean expression. So anytime you're programming and you run into that, where you're actually having to do an iteration before you check the while loop, that is a red flag. You should stop and use a do while loop. That's kind of the purpose of that. Okay, so I'm gonna get rid of this. That's kind of a suboptimal way of solving the problem. It is more natural to use a do while loop. And so here's what our code would look like. Notice we don't have that repetition. So we didn't have to copy and paste these 2 lines of code outside of the do while loop, right? So it cuts down on repetition. Okay, so that's a do while loop. Jumping back. Next is a switch statement. And a switch statement, in some ways, it has a lot of new syntax to it. But once you understand the syntax and what it's doing, you realize that a switch statement is nothing more than a series of if, else, if checks. And so there's new syntax here, but in terms of what it's actually doing, it's quite familiar. So here I'm showing you the syntax of a switch statement. So we have the switch keyword, and then so we have the switch keyword. Inside of here, you will enter a variable name. So let's say we had an integer variable called option. So then this would be option. Okay, so we're going to switch. Here you would type the name of a variable whose value you're interested in checking. Then we have our open curly bracket, and then we have various cases. Each case is testing for one particular value. So here, you would not like literally write value 1. This is a possible value. So in our case, we have an integer variable called option, and maybe I want to know, okay, does it equal 1? So this would be case and then the number 1. And does it equal 2? So this would be case and then the number 2. And you can have as many cases as you want. I'm just showing 2 here. So basically what happens is the computer takes this variable and it just does a bunch of if checks. So it says, okay, does the variable equal value 1? If so, then it executes this code here, and then it breaks, and we'll talk about what breaking is. If this is not true, it jumps down to case 2. It checks if the variable equals value 2. If so, it executes this code and breaks. Otherwise, ... it just keeps checking, right, each case in turn. And then at the end, you can have a default case. This code executes if the variable equaled none of the previous values, and it is the same as an else statement. So this switch statement is the same as this set of if, else, if. Okay, so it's doing literally exactly the same thing. So here I'm saying, you know, if the variable equals value 1, go inside and execute this code. Else, if it equals value 2, go inside and execute this code. ... You can have as many else ifs as you want. And then at the end, we have kind of a default else. So literally, this code with the switch statement and this code of if, else, if statements are identical. They're doing the same thing. Okay, so what is the difference then between them? So there are some subtle differences. So the first subtle difference is that you can only use a switch statement with a variable of type byte, short, char, int, or string. So you could not use a switch statement to check the value of a double. And you could not use a switch statement to check the value of a reference variable. So a variable of type organism or of type tally counter. So the switch statement is restricted in the type of the variable that you can put here. Okay. Oftentimes switch statements are used either for ints or strings. Those are probably the most common use. The second thing has to do with this interesting break statement here. And what does this mean? So the break keyword, so this breaks you out of the innermost scope. So this break keyword is a general keyword. You can use it in other contexts. Like I could use this, for example, in a while loop. So it's not tied to the switch statement. Anytime the computer encounters a break statement, what it does is it breaks you out of the innermost scope. In this case, the innermost scope is a switch statement, right? So that's the scope that we are living inside of. So we've got this opening curly bracket and we've got this closing curly bracket, and that defines our scope. So when the computer encounters this break statement, right? So let's say that the variable does have value 1. We've executed all of this code. We hit the break statement, right? It's going to jump past all of the rest of the switch statement, right? And execution is going to resume after the switch statement. Okay. So it is the break keyword, right, that causes the switch statement to act just like a series of else if statements, right? And so here, the same thing happens. So if this is true, then we execute the code inside, and then we jump all the way to the bottom and we keep going. Okay, or maybe if the variable doesn't equal value 1, but equals value 2, right? Then if this is true, we execute the code inside, and then we jump all the way to the bottom. We don't keep checking. Okay, so the break keyword is what makes a switch statement act identical to a series of if, else, if statements. Now, we don't need to use the break statement. It is optional. And this is where a switch statement differs from a series of if, else, if statements. And it kind of has some interesting and cool behavior. If we did not have the break statements in here, then what happens is known as falling through. And falling through means when we have a value that matches, so when we ask, does variable equal value 1? If that's true, we would execute the corresponding code, but then we would execute every single case thereafter. Okay, because if there's no break statement telling us to jump out, then instead the computer will fall through and it will actually execute not just this code, it will execute all of the code going forward. Okay, so just to summarize, because that was kind of a lot, there is some new syntax. So we've got a switch keyword, we've got a case keyword, and we have this break keyword. Break breaks you out of the innermost scope. Here for a switch, you put in your variable name and then you have the values you want to check. A switch statement can only be used on these 5 types. And the behavior of the switch statement, honestly, is identical to an if, else, if, else, if, else. Like literally, there's no difference, right? So a switch statement is just a series of if, else, if checks, but it's restricted to these 5 types. And this is kind of the cool thing, if you remove these break statements here, then you get some very interesting behavior where when it finds a match, it executes not just that code, but all code. And so in those 2 ways, a switch statement differs from if, else, if, else, if. Okay, so it's restricted by the type of the variable. And if you remove the break keyword, it falls through and you get some kind of funky, cool behavior. Okay, let's ground all of that in an example. So let's switch back over to BlueJ. And I have some more kind of a basic example here. So let's say that we have this menu. So I'm going to say enter choice. So the first choice is you want to find the length of a string. The second choice is you want to generate a random number. And the third choice is you want to quit. And then we read in their option by calling scan.exit. Okay, so let's write a switch statement for this. So we'd start with the switch keyword. Okay. And then we need to put in the name of a variable. For us, we want to switch on, or we're interested in testing the value of the option variable. Then we've got 3 cases we're interested in. So we have case 1. This is a 1 because here, if the user typed an integer, if they typed 1, then option is going to store the number 1, and we want to check if it has 1. I did not type 1 because it's the first case. It's not like first case, second case, third case, fourth case. Okay, I typed 1 because that's the number I want to check for. Did the user type the number 1? Okay, so if they did type the number 1, then they want to find the length of a string. So let's ask them to enter it. So system.out.println, okay, type a string. Okay, we will then scan that. And we will then print out the length of that string, so word.length. Okay, after that, I'm going to type break so that once we finish executing that, we'll break out of the switch statement and we'll be done. Okay, the next value I want to check is 2. So if the user enters 2, it means they'd like to generate a random number. So let's say system.out.println, enter an upper bound. Okay, we'll read that in, int upper bound equals scan.next int. Okay, we'll get our random number. What did I call it? Oh, I didn't create an RNG, so let's do that. Random RNG equals new random. Okay, so RNG.next int, and we'll pass in our upper bound. This will give us a number between 0 and 1 minus the upper bound. For now, let's just assume that that's sufficient. So system.out.println, random number, and then break. Okay, so if the user types 2, then we will generate a random number for them, and then we'll break out of the switch statement. Last but not least, I could have a case 3, or I could, actually let's do that. So case 3, in case 3, we don't need to do anything. They want to quit the program, so we'll just immediately break. And then if they try to be clever and type anything besides 1, 2, or 3, we'll have a default case, and we'll just tell them system.out.println, invalid. Okay. Okay, so here's my switch statement. And when we run it, the user will type an integer, either 1, 2, 3, or maybe they'll try and be clever and type something else. We have a switch statement here, and we're switching on the variable option. We're going to test if option equals 1, if it equals 2, or if it equals 3. Depending upon what it equals, we'll do each of these operations here, either getting a string and printing its length, generating a random number, or just breaking. Okay, so let's start off by just running this. Okay, so let's do number 1, type a string. Let's try that again. Okay, let's choose option 1, type a string, hello, and there we go. Okay, so it tells us that there's 5 letters in hello. If we were to choose the other option, let's do something between 0 and 99, I guess. So we get 79. If we were to just immediately quit, it would quit. And if we were to choose something other than 1, 2, or 3, like 100, it would say invalid option. Okay, so other than that logical error I had, everything works as expected. Okay, now the fun part is let's take out the break keywords and see what would happen. Okay. Okay, just for the heck of it, let's choose option 1. So say type a string. Okay, no, let's type an actual string, watermelon. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so that's 10 letters, so it should print 10. Okay, and it did. Now, after it executed the code for case 1, because there was no break statement, it's falling through. And now it's going to execute everything, right? Case 2, case 3, and the default. Okay, so we're on to case 2. So enter an upper bound, 56. There we go. Then the code for case 3 was nothing, so it did nothing. And then it even executed the default case, and so it printed invalid option. Okay, so going back to our code, we can kind of line our code up with this print statement here. So without the breaks, it did this, right? So it asked us to type a string, and then it fell through. So then it asked us for an upper bound. Okay, so that's here. Then it did nothing, and then it printed invalid option. Okay, so that's kind of the cool thing about a switch statement, which is it does have this property of falling through. Or if you want to just use a switch statement like a good old-fashioned if-else if, you can insert the break keywords, and that will keep it from falling through. Now, students always ask me, when should I use a switch statement versus an if-else if? And I have maybe 2 answers to that. One is a historical answer, which is the switch statement was kind of added to early programming languages just because at the time it was a behavior that people wanted. And what I mean by that is at the time, so in the 1950s, 60s, at that time, this behavior of falling through was something that people found very useful. I don't know what they were working on, but whatever it was, they found it very useful. Today, though, to be honest, I tend to simply use a switch statement when I have a menu. So that's a common use that I'll use a switch statement for. And so that's why we're going to do it. We're going to use a switch statement and do while loop for our controller class. So I tend to use it for menus or anytime I just have a discrete, like I really just want to test like 1 or 2, 3 values. I kind of tend to wrap it up in a switch statement. I rarely encounter scenarios where I need the falling through. I think it's super cool that it falls through, but to be honest, I don't think I've ever had an instance where I'm programming and I was like, I need it to fall through. So I tend to use switch statements and I use the break keyword and I use it when I'm doing menus or anything where I have like just a few options I want to test for. And I tend to do that over a sequence of if-else ifs. At some point though, if I have like a lot of cases, I'll just switch over to the if-else if. So for example, we wrote a piece of code where someone would enter a number between 0 and 100 and it was a grade, a numerical grade, and we printed out the corresponding letter grade. And we had a lot of different cases there. I might use a switch statement, but I find once my number of cases kind of grows large, I just switch over to the if-else if. So that's just kind of my opinion. Really, it was added for historical reasons because back in the 50s, 60s, this was a functionality that people wanted. Today, though, personally, I've never needed falling through. I think it's cool. And I just I tend to use switch statements when I have either a menu or any other application where I just have a few different cases. Once it gets beyond like 2 or 3 cases, I tend to move to an if and else if. That's just personal preference. Okay, so having said all of that, let's just go back really quickly. Okay, so we are going to use the do while and the switch statement to create a menu of options. And so I'm gonna give you the rough skeleton of that. But in the in-class problems, I'll actually list for you, here are the different functionalities we want our menu to be able to do. Okay, and then our in-class problems this week will be actually implementing that controller. Okay, let's just do a quick maybe sketch of what this code is going to look like. So we can close this out. Okay, so here is chapter 5. Okay, so here's my book class. This is the bookcase class that we're working on. Here's the book controller, and it's empty right now. Here's a look at what it will be when we're done. Okay, so we'll have a menu of options. They can add a book, remove a book, search for a book, get a random book, list the books, or quit. So when I say menu, that's kind of what I'm envisioning, is that we'll print this menu. Users can choose an option, we'll execute that, and then we'll print it again in a loop. And then when they want to quit the application, they can type 6. Down here, I'm scanning through. This is kind of a look at what our do while loop and our switch statement will be. So let me actually just give us some kind of a skeleton right now. So basically what we want to do, and this will not be actual code, but I'm going to write some comments here. So what we want to do is we want to print the menu, okay, and read the user's choice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, 6 being quit. Okay. Then we're going to have a switch statement, and we're going to switch on this variable choice, which it will be an integer. And then we have these different cases, right? Like case 1, I think, was they want to add a book. Case 2, let's open this up. Case 2 is removing a book. Oh, here we go. Remove a book. Case 3 will be search for a book. Case 4 will be get a random book. Case 5, I think, is list all the books. And case 6 is quit. Okay, so while their choice does not equal 6, this is what we want to do. Okay, so here's the skeleton of our menu. Notice that I have a do while loop, and inside I've nested a switch statement, and together they're going to work to implement this menu. I've put in kind of comments here what you will be doing for your in-class problems, and so this is kind of meant to help you get started. So first you want to print the menu, then you'll use a scanner to read in the user's choice, and that's an integer. Then we will switch on that integer. If the user typed 1, they want to add a book, and so here would be code for calling methods in the book case class to add a book. And you'll have to ask the user to enter the title, enter the author, read all of that in, and then pass that to the bookcase class. If the user types 2, then they want to remove a book. And so then you need to print all the books and ask them which book they want to remove. So what position in the bookcase or what position in the list. Search for a book. So if they type 3, then you'll need to ask them, okay, enter the title of the book you want to search for. If they type 4, they want to get a random book. So we'd call that method in the bookcase class, and we'd print out a recommendation like, hey, you should read this book. Case 5 is just calling the toString method in the bookcase class, and we'll print all the books. And lastly, case 6 is quitting. While they do not enter 6, we're going to do this again and again and again. When they type 6, right, the while loop will end and we'll be done. Okay, so that is that. This is kind of a skeleton of what the menu or the controller class should look like. The rest of the details are in the in-class problems, and let's do a quick recap here. Okay, we have the do while loop. We have the do while loop. It's just a while loop flipped on its head. A do while loop does 1 or more iterations. A while loop does 0 or more iterations. A do while loop is useful for when you need to do a few steps before you check the Boolean expression. Next is the switch statement. The switch statement is a lot of new syntax. So there's the switch keyword and all the cases and breaking and all that. But basically it's the equivalent of an if, else, if series of statements. The variable that you're switching on can only have one of these 5 types. You list the values you want to check, and then the break keyword here breaks you out of the switch statement. If you don't have the break keywords, then when a match is found, not just that code, but all code thereafter is executed in what is known as falling through, which is kind of interesting. That's basically it. Just really quickly going back to our examples here. Just a reminder, this variable that shows up in our Boolean expression must be declared outside of the do while loop, or you will get a compile time error. And for the switch, ooh, that's weird. Okay. Okay. And for the switch statement here, this just kind of shows you what I mean by fall through. So if we have the break statements, it will execute whatever case or option the user chooses. If we don't have the break statement, then for example, if they choose option 1, it would execute not just this code, but all code thereafter. And that's what I mean when I say falling through. Okay, that is that. And our goal this week is to finish up this bookcase example by implementing the controller class. So that's that.